We are continuing in our series, Becoming an Emotionally Healthy Christian. And so today we are going to take a look back. Is that painful for anybody to look back? We're going to look back in order to go forward. We're going to do it in a really healthy way. We're going to see what we can pick up from our past that we want to move forward with, and what we need to deal with so that then we can move forward in a healthy way. It's really important in our pathway to become emotionally healthy, to embrace our past, to look at it, to take it in, to study it, and then to break free from anything that is destructive, any sinful patterns that have been put in place, any emotional breakdowns that have not been dealt with, either by us or by people in our family who have affected us. And in order to do that, we need to look hard, and we need to take it to God, and we need to seek the right kind of direction and help as we need it, and then we can live the life God has intended us to live. I want us to look at two biblical truths that pastor and author Peter Scazzero has noted. Number one is the blessings and sins of our families, going back 2 to 3 generations, profoundly impact who we are today. Now, there are going to be several, what I'm calling reflection points in the lesson today, where we need to pause, or you can pause, and you go back and look at the video and pause again, and really think it through. But here's what this says. Blessings flow forward. And blessings, and according to his research, 2 or 3 generations can really help a family. It can bless a family for a long time. And also, the consequences of sin that affect families from 2 to 3 generations have a profound impact on us. And the second thing is discipleship requires putting off the sinful patterns of our family of origin and relearning how to do life God's way in God's family. Now let's unpack that just a little bit, because here's where we get hope. We get hope that we can take those sinful patterns from the past, those emotionally unhealthy people in our past, in our families who have set this pattern in place, and we can make a path forward and look at the word that is used, discipleship. Now, another Christian term for that is this process of sanctification. And once we give our hearts and lives to Jesus, we set forth on this whole journey of sanctification for the rest of our lives. And that's the process of moving forward with Christ to have this closest relationship we can have with him, the one he expects us to have, the one that we want to have. And it's a process of fine-tuning, and it's a process of taking a step back or taking a wrong turn and then always coming back and looking at our life as finding the trajectory that is constantly moving forward. Even though we make a slight misstep, we get back. We get into trouble when it's more than a slight misstep. It's one that begins to look like this, or we end up going in the wrong direction. And so we always want to make sure that as a part of our sanctification process, we quickly make an adjustment to keep going forward. Well, the truth is that we all come from broken families. Some are less functional than others. But since the first child, Cain, killed his brother Abel, we have passed down dysfunction and sin from generation to generation. We learned from our therapist, Barbara Driscoll, a couple of weeks ago about the trauma we experience as children and as youth. We have learned that we have an imprint and an impact on our life that begins when we are very young. Did you know that by age 7, and some researchers have put that number at 6, and some go all the way up to maybe 10, but about 7 years old, we have an imprint on our life that tells us that this is how life is. That is a reflection point right there. So we want to be thinking about child development and how what happens in our development as children impacts us through our entire life. It's said that the most important milestones in our life happens before age 7. The Greek philosopher Aristotle once said this, "Give me a child until he is 7, and I will show you the man." You know, when I learned that and I read that and I've been pondering that for many weeks now, I started thinking of my own grandchildren, because those are the freshest memories of youth right now. Bitterness and lack of forgiveness and hatred. And I chose to let God use those things to inform my future and even to help me to be in a ministry for women who were dealing with the very same experiences. Well, Joseph's story in the Bible, yes, our Joseph with the coat of many colors, had a very dysfunctional family. We're going to look at the highlight reel of Joseph's life. First of all, he comes from a blended family. His dad had children from 2 wives and 2 concubines. Joseph is the 11th child. He's one of 12 brothers and a sister. Joseph was a special son, and that made the others jealous. You can already hear from just those highlights that there was probably going to be some struggle and some strife in Joseph's life. But by the time he was age 17, he had major traumas. At age 17 is when he was thrown into the deep well by his brothers. Then he was sold as a slave to the equivalent of 2 years' income, which today, if the average is $40,000 a year, maybe it was about $80,000 in equivalent money today. And his father was told that he was dead. So in this process, he loses his language, his culture, his family, and his freedom. And then he was in prison unjustly for many years. In this reflective pause, let's consider that time of Joseph's life and the impact that must have had. And let's consider the years he spent in prison and how that was an opportunity to reflect on his life and the choices that Joseph could have made about all those things that happened to him. Imagine what he pondered in prison. What was he thinking about? And then we need to ask ourselves, what would I be thinking about? What was he thinking about his family? What was he thinking about God? What we think about our traumas determine whether or not we move forward or stay stuck. And let me say that again. What we think about our traumas determine whether we move forward or stay stuck. Well, Joseph has 22 years before he sees his brothers again. That's a long time to ponder, isn't it? So what happened in the meantime? Did he choose to live in anger and bitterness? Did he plot revenge? Or did he process this desolation, which is a topic we talked about last week? Did he go to the Lord with his desolation and turn it into some consolation? And that was the choice that Joseph made. He chose to take the trauma of his life and turn it over to God and seek a way forward. And we have that choice too. We get to decide how we're going to take the encounters of our past, our growing up years, the history that we have with family members or other people, and we get to decide if we are going to live in the past, focused on the wrongs that were done to us, and stay a victim, or are we going to do the hard work that would sound something like this, taking it to the Lord in prayer, seeking His guidance, talking to professionals, learning to let go, turning the sorrow and the anguish into something that God can use for good. Those are the choices that we have. Well, Joseph believed at a very young age that God had destined him for a good future. He destined him for greatness. Through dreams that Joseph had, God made it clear that Joseph was going to rise to leadership, and he was going to even be a leader over his parents and his brothers. Joseph knew that. And revealing that was a little bit of what got him in trouble, wasn't it? Well, Joseph held on to that promise, that vision God had for his life. He knew God had placed a plan in Joseph's life. And deep in his heart, he knew he had a purpose. So he did not let the trauma dictate his future. God has a vision for each of us. He has a purpose for each of us. And the general purpose is to always worship and adore God. And the other part is to encourage and love other people. That's the big, broad vision of God's plan for each of us. And then He's equipped each of us with gifts and talents and skills, just as He did Joseph. And we are to use those walking in His purpose. And when the traumas come, it does not change God's plan and purpose. It sometimes means we are taking a detour and we have a setback and we have to sort through and work through those things. But we are called to do those two things, always to glorify God and to lift up others as we walk in our purpose. Sometimes we tend to use those circumstances, though, to circumvent our purpose and to make us victims of the past. I talked to someone just this week who had something happen in their life, and it was a job change that really caught this person off guard, and it wasn't what he had expected to happen, and had given a wonderful long life into this career and felt it was God's purpose, and all of a sudden that was taken away. And what do you do when somebody else has changed God's plan? Well, what we know is that God's plan is still there. It's just going to take a different form. It's going to look differently. But you cannot deter God from His purpose in our lives. There is no way it can happen unless we don't walk in His way. And God will reveal to this person what his next step is and what his plan is. And our job is to always stay faithful to God and His purpose and His plan. This is what Joseph did. He clung to the promise. And he spent his time in prison living in his purpose. He consistently chose to do the right thing. Even when he was ignored in prison, people didn't understand him. He was passed over and looked over, and he was sexually tempted. But he listened to God at every turn. And God continued to pour into his purpose and his gifts and his skills. God continued to let Joseph have the dreams and let Joseph interpret the dreams. And Joseph never forgot to give God the credit. Joseph stayed faithful even through the even tho's of his life. Joseph didn't sit idly in prison. He didn't contemplate revenge. He didn't make bad choices and then make excuses. He moved forward in spite of his past. And then 22 years later, he encounters his brothers. That is in Genesis 42. He sees them. They see him. It is a moment, isn't it? It's a moment of choice and decision. And Joseph let God lead him every step of the way, even though he had every reason to be bitter. He had been enslaved, but he wasn't enslaved to his past. He clearly understood his heritage. He understood what happened in the past with his family, but he allowed God, not his family of origin, to determine his future. Let's take a look at what happens in Genesis 50. Beginning with verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God, of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good in order to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. See, Joseph broke through from the normal family tradition by forgiving his brothers. He changed the pattern. It took many years, but Joseph stayed faithful and had a breakthrough and changed the trajectory of his family for the next generation. Genesis 50, verse 20, is pretty much a summary of the Old Testament, and really it can be a summary for our lives too when people intend to harm us. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Because here's the promise God gives us, that when good comes upon us and people attack us and people do us wrong and injure us and hurt us, God will find a way to make that good. And it doesn't mean a restoration of relationships, and it doesn't always mean that things will be rosy and nice and fun forever. But what it will mean is that we have an opportunity to make something good out of that and to use it for good, to inform us, to help us to become more compassionate and more understanding, and to find a way to be to encourage somebody else who perhaps has gone through something very similar. That's what I found in my experience, that it's helped me to be compassionate to others who are going through something similar. Jeremiah the prophet reminds us that God has a plan for each of us, and we read in Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." As part of a legacy in our family, my mother poured that scripture into all of her children and her grandchildren, and our kids can't help but think of their grand in any other way, but as someone who is preaching and teaching this message, that God has a plan and a purpose for your life. Well, we also read in Romans that all those things in the past, that the gunk and the junk of childhood, mistreatment that you've experienced, bad choices that either we have made or others have made against us. God will use them for good in our lives. We read in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So he works through what has happened, the junk and the gunk. He works through them so that in the end they will turn into something good. Now notice the last half of that verse reminds us is that it's for those who've been called according to his purpose. That means we are followers of him and we are abiding by his principles and living for him. This is what he will do for us. Let's look at 4 lessons from Joseph's life. First of all, Joseph understood God's goodness and his love. And he knew that that goodness and love was still there in the storm. He wasn't one to blame God for the things that happened. He wasn't one to blame God for being thrown into the pit. He wasn't one to blame God when Potiphar's wife was tempting him. He wasn't doing that. He was trusting God and knowing that God was good even in the bad. He expressed his emotions and his loss. Did you get that? He expressed himself. He shared how he felt, and that allowed him to truly live in forgiveness. And number 3, he moved forward despite his past. Partnered with God to bless others. Look at that wonderful little trinket in there. He partnered with God to know how to bless others and pass blessings forward. Even though he had every reason to hold everything to himself and to let the events of his past scar him and keep him closed up and not reach out to others, but he chose to partner with God and be a blessing to others. Well, sin and rebellion destroyed families. It continues to destroy families from God's, the origin of man. Cain and Abel were just the beginning. How many generations after that were messed up in Scripture? All of our lives, all of our families are messed up in some way. But Jesus allows us all to be born again, born into a new relationship and a new relationship with him and others. But we need to put to the past, and work to be transformed to move forward to a future. Now, in order to do that, we need to go deep into the surface of family so that we can understand the spiritual and emotional impact the past has had on us. So I'm asking this question: what is the iceberg in the family? Isn't that an ugly thing to have to think about? What is buried deep in the iceberg? Well, author Peter Scazzaro says each of our family members, or those who raised us through childhood, has imprinted certain ways of behaving and thinking into us. Now, he calls this pattern of behavior a set of commandments. And so we're going to look at these 10 commandments of family that could have been a part of your experience or not. And so I'm going to read these 10 commandments, and you see if this was a part of your family or if there was something similar that would have been there, or no, you can't even relate to this because your family was very, very different. But these are just some ideas for us to consider to see if these are family habits, traditions buried in the iceberg that either you have dealt with and moved forward, or they're still a part of the deep iceberg. Number 1, money. What was the talk about money in the home or for generations? And so was this something that was taught? Money is the best source of security. The more money you have, the more important you are. And what about conflict? Is this something that was taught in your home to avoid conflict at all cost? Don't get people mad at you. Or was this the norm? Go ahead and be loud and be angry and constantly fight with others. So what was the norm when it comes to conflict? Number 3, how was sex discussed or talked about in your home? Was it not spoken about openly? Was this the mantra, men can be promiscuous, but women must be chaste? And sexuality in marriage will come easily. What were the norms that were set out that you had to sort through at some point in your life? Grief and loss. Was this spoken in your home or not spoken, but suggested that sadness is a sign of weakness? And was it ever stated or implied that you are not allowed to be depressed and sad and have some sorrow? Were you taught to get over losses quickly and move on instead of expressing emotions in a healthy way? Well, what about expressing anger? Were you taught that anger is dangerous and bad? Explode in anger to make a point? And this is an interesting point also, sarcasm. Is sarcasm taught as an acceptable way to release anger? Or were you taught, on the other hand, that there is, you can sin, and you can get angry, but you can't sin? And that's the biblical principle. You can be angry about things. That's an emotion. But the test is, will you sin in your anger? And number 6, what about family? Duty to family and culture comes before everything. Was that the loyalty? You owe your parents for all they've done for you. Well, okay, maybe I said that a time or two. I did give childbirth 22 hours, 24 hours, and so, yeah, they owe me a few things, right? So maybe I may have scarred them in some way. Do they talk about dirty laundry in public, or is it we keep our dirty laundry in the home? What was the family discussion, the family topic? What about relationships? Were you taught not to trust people? Were you told people will always let you down? Was something said similar to nobody will ever hurt me again? Were you taught never to be vulnerable? Or were you taught healthy aspects of relationships? What about attitudes toward other cultures? Only be close with people who are like you. Do not marry a person of another race or culture. Certain cultures and races are not as good as mine. Were those some of the things that you have had to sort through and deal with and contemplate and still are? What about success? Is getting into the best schools, is that what success was in your home? Is making lots of money a sign of success? Is getting married and having children a sign of success? Or what is it? What is it? I often hear people say their greatest goal for their family and their children is, I just want them to be happy. Is that appropriate? Or do we want more? I'm happy today, but I may not be happy tomorrow. I want to live in joy, though, in spite of the unhappy moments. What about feelings and emotions? You're not allowed to have certain feelings. Your feelings are not important. Reacting with your feelings without thinking is okay. So these are interesting looks at what commandments were stated, but probably weren't posted on the wall. But it's what perhaps was lived out in many homes. So think about your own family's commandments. How has your family of origin impacted you and your relationships and your parenting? And what role did the 10 commandments have? How did they shape your view on marriage and physical affection, your view of God, your view of church, your view of different denominations, your view of different religions. So I have a space for you just whenever you choose to, if you want to do that, is to just write down those things that your family's commandments. And you can do this on your own at some time as you begin to think about things that you've been taught and you begin to question whether or not those were valid and how that's impacted your life. So I've just given you that space to do that. And then I want us to take a look at the needs pie. Now, the needs pie is what Barbara Driscoll introduced us to a couple of weeks ago. And what she taught us was that at a young age, children have a need, and the needs are either met or they are not. And from the very time of birth through those young years, it's important who is meeting the needs. And so what she has asked us to consider is, were our social, emotional, physical, and spiritual needs met in our childhood and in our youth years? And did two parents meet the need? Was it one parent? Was it a caregiver? Was it a grandmother, a grandfather? Or who was it meeting the needs? Could it have been neighbors or church members or friends? So consider filling in your needs pie. And I've given you the handouts. It's in the back of your packet. And you'll see the one that she gave us, I condensed onto this one page. And it tells, this is just a sample of how it might have looked in someone's life to have their needs met by various people, whether it is at birth or by the age of 5. And notice that she has given us other helpful information about brain development. And so the brain is underdeveloped at birth. And then it begins a rapid growth by the age of 5. And that we are just learning to think and reason. This is the period where we're getting an imprint on our life about how life is going to be. And then look at a child's needs at age 12. Who is pouring into the child? Who is giving support emotionally and spiritually and physically and socially as the brain is continuing to grow? What is happening with those emotions during very, very rough periods of childhood? And then we move to age 18, where the brain is functioning at a high level, but it's still developing. We're very vulnerable to emotions, and very often what happens is the emotions overrule the ability to reason. And that happens until around age 25, when the prefrontal cortex has formed. But prior to that, we're living on emotions. And how did that look in the family? And then adult needs beyond age 24 and beyond. This is when the brain is fully developed. We should have the ability to reason while at the same time considering our feelings, knowing who we are. And so let's put this together with what we have learned also last week, and that's that the key of having the ability to take our feelings on one hand and our ability to reason on the other hand, join those together so that then we are equipped to make decisions and to move forward in a healthy spiritual way. Because they're both valid. God created us that way. He gave us this brain that was developed to do that. He gave us the amygdala in the back of the brain, that little almond-shaped part of our brain, and that's the ability to feel and to have emotion. He gave that for a reason. And then he gave us this ability to reason right here in the prefrontal cortex. And he gave us both to use as we need. But here's how it looks. He gave us this is our brain. And the amygdala is right here. And our emotions are tucked away deep in our brain, while our ability to reason is covering it. And this is how he wants us to be set. This is our set point. Using our reason so that our emotions do not flip. And so looking back at the family impact, we want to see if the family was flipped most of the time, or if they had that healthy balance of emotion and reason. And if life was lived flipped, then maybe that is the source of a lot of heartbreak and heartache in the family. And so those would be how the needs were met in just a child. She just made up the numbers there. Would be an ideal way for life to look on this one. And then I've given you a blank one for you as you choose to take and to study and to write down how your needs were met. And you would write down the names of the people or some other descriptor of the person as a caregiver or a family friend or a neighbor or a church nursery worker or whoever it was pouring into you at these ages. And you're looking for the gaps that have not been dealt with. And if the needs were not met, it will show there may be some troubling areas that you haven't dealt with or that you haven't forgiven. This doesn't mean that you excuse them, but you forgive them. You deal with them, and then you let go of them so that you can move forward and not let the sins of the past hold you back. And then you want to see which commandments may have given you some gaps and may have kept you stuck in some way, because they will show up in a pie as well. And you want to see if any of those are holding you back emotionally and spiritually. So let's look now at another tool for us to consider family. It's called the Beavers Scale of Family Functioning. Now, we have considered the family tree and how you go back 2 or 3 generations. We've looked at the family commandments, and we've looked at the needs pie. And so we're now going to look at another way to examine either our family in the past or our family in the present. And so this scale, it was developed by a psychiatrist, Dr. Robert Beavers, and it's a way to measure the emotional health of your family. We're going to see 5 developmental levels and patterns of relating within the family. So we're going to begin with the lowest classification. The highest number is the lowest level of emotional competence in a family system. So this is the family in pain. This is a disturbed system. It is the most dysfunctional level of family. It's characterized by disorganization, feelings of apprehension. There's a permeating sense of imminent danger. The family lacks authority. They don't have a clear leader in the family. There's little in the way of dependable interpersonal connection. Okay, so that's the bottom level of a family. Level 4 is called the borderline family. This exhibits limited improvement in relational functioning over the previous one. In an effort to master the chaos of the family, it swings to the polar opposite of disorganization, and it has this very rigid set of rules. So you see, level 5 was chaos reigns. Now we go to a rigid set of rules. This is run by a tyrant who uses coercion and intimidation. There is a pattern of dominance and submission. So this is designed to control not only the actions, but look at this, the thoughts and the feelings of everybody within the family. So this is a system that's governed by black and white. Those are the perceptions of everything, black and white, as determined by the tyrant. And individuals are seen as either perfect or monsters in the family. And then we move to level 3. This is the rule-bound family. It operates under the strict behavioral dictates of the previous level, but the controls on the conduct emerge from within the person, not from those rules imposed by the tyrant. So here's how that looks. The family consistently says we ought to, we should, we need to, we have to. That is what's governing what they do. That's the code of family conduct. We ought to be doing this, we should be doing that, you ought to do this, you ought not do that. What family members actually think and feel is sacrificed by what you ought to think and feel. Rules regulate behavior, and there is little spontaneity. Individuality of emotions is repressed for whatever is good for all. So individuality is secondary to the family unit. The family is still limited in its potential for intimacy. So I hope you've heard in these 3 lower levels, there is very little emotional connection in the family, very little intimacy, very little spontaneity. It's all rules, what we should do, what we need to do. There's either the tyrant ruling or the list of rules, and each person is now living by what they ought to do. So you can imagine there's a lot of guilt. There is a lot of worry. There must be a lot of anxiety in the family, and very little of connecting emotionally within the family. Now let's move to levels 2 and 1. So level 2 is the adequate family, and that and the highest level, the optimal family, share many characteristics. And these two represent the highest development in family life. They are able to listen attentively to input from the family members. So listening is now a part of the family. In level 2, the rules are clear, but they're not written in stone. Their purpose is understood as serving the best interest of people. And that's the top priority, serving the best interest of the individual. Rules are to be revisited. There is more of an openness for growth and change and flexibility. They are making connections individually and intimately. Let's go to the top level. The optimal family is able to adapt better than all previous levels to changes in the family and its life cycle of events. Now, just even pause on that. As things happen in life, as people get married, or there is an upset in the family, or there has been something happening to a child and they've had setbacks and made bad decisions, they are better able to adapt. This is mainly due to a deep sense of security and trust in the emotional connection between the family members. When conflicts arise, there's a firm belief in the possibility of working them out, or if not, respecting the difference of viewpoints. A full range of feelings can be expressed and is even embraced as part of that individual family member's humanity. So you can feel, you can express yourself in this family, and it's embraced, it's expressed in a healthy way. The group is not threatened by individual differences. Now think about what we've learned about the personalities. Think about a healthy family at the optimal level, embraces all the personalities. They love each other for their uniqueness. And it seems to be they're all striving to live in their strengths. And finally, the optimal family experiences genuine pleasure in one another's company. So questions to consider just quietly, privately, and later. Which family group describes your family? And how does that impact you today? Are there areas that you need to begin to work on so that you can grow emotionally and to grow closer to Christ? So recognizing the family of origin is key, because that then helps you to set out on this path forward. So in working with families here over the last 17 years, part of what I did was teach in Married with Children, a group of young marrieds, and holding some couples sessions and working with couples. And one thing that it was stressed in all of these studies is you both bring a family of origin into a marriage, and they're unlikely to be just alike. And so sorting through the differences in the family of origin so that you begin a new family and that you grow from the origin from which you came is the key to a healthy marriage. So how many families are living the optimal family life? And how would the world look if there were optimal families everywhere? Because that's God's design and that's His plan. What was the first family an optimal family? Adam and Eve and the young'uns. No, we didn't even start well, did we? But God had a plan. I mean, that gives us some relief, doesn't it? But he did still have a plan. And do you know that after Adam and Eve sinned, they had another chance, didn't they? And in the end, Eve began to pray for her new children, and Eve did the next right thing. She thanked God for her new children and moved forward, beginning a more optimal family life. And that's what chance we all have, whether we are the matriarch in the family or whether we are not the matriarch, whether we're a family of one or we're a family of many. We want to be optimal in the way that we are living. So what do you do when you have an unhealthy background in the family? We begin to do the hard work of moving forward and uncovering the things in the iceberg. And then at the same time, we often still have to deal with the unhealthy family members who are still abiding by the wrong 10 commandments, who did not have their emotional pie filled properly, and who are living as a family in pain. Does anybody have to deal with those kinds of family members in your life? And maybe not a family member, but maybe somebody else who comes from a history of unhealthy family life. So what do you do about it? Well, we've learned lots of tips and strategies over the last weeks and for many years that I've been teaching, but I want to share with you some more today. When we are dealing with unhealthy family members from a past that's wrong, that's bad, or anybody who's unhealthy. I've taught many times about going to the castle. We learned a couple of weeks ago about the 5-finger prayer. We have learned to press pause and make good decisions, but I want to share with you a couple of other visualization techniques. And the first one is the box technique. So when somebody from your past or somebody who's toxic, somebody who's really upsetting you, who's not respecting your boundaries, imagine that person in a box. You get to put the person in a box. Now imagine they're in the box and you cannot hear them in the box. If you don't want to, it doesn't have to be a glass box. You can make it a covered box and you cannot even see the unhealthy person. Anybody want to put them there? And then we're in the box, even though you might, in reality, be sitting next to the person or looking at the person because they're in your presence, you have them in a box. Okay? And they're in the box, and you're just talking the niceties, and you're nodding, you're planning your exit path, the exit ramp, And for all practical purposes, you're engaged, but you're not taking the bait because they are in a box. So this gives you the mental space to disconnect from their toxicity. And it gives you the time to know how to respond. So that's the box technique. And then there's the windows technique. So imagine a big building with lots of windows that are sealed up. And so you've had all these toxic thoughts, these terrible thoughts, these situations that are cropping up, and you're not dealing with them. And they're becoming oppressive, and they're too frequent, and they're just happening over and over, and we need to deal with the thoughts. So you can imagine putting the toxic thought that you have about the family issue, the person in the family, what they have done to your past, the bad decisions that they've made, the upsetting situation that is happening in your life because of this person. You can imagine putting those thoughts behind that window in the big building. And the thought goes behind the window. You can't climb into that window. That window is sealed. You are safe outside that window. What's inside that window cannot hurt you. And the thought stays out there. You can label the thought, negative thought. Aunt Sally is oppressive. Daddy caused all the problems. That thought that keeps going over and over. It stays behind the window, allowing you time to process the thought pattern. The key is to process the issue that's causing this whole train of thoughts that keep going through your head. But it can't happen at that moment because you're trying to engage in something else. You're trying to, you're in a moment where you can't have those thoughts going, and you have to function in whatever situation you're required to function in. And so the thought has to be set aside. But here's what you have to know to do. At some point, you have to process the issue. And then you will need to reconceptualize that issue. And that means you would need to learn to think of it in a new and emotionally healthy way. That means you might need to get help in learning how to process those thoughts. And then the third is setting those appropriate boundaries. In order to be emotionally healthy yourself, it will be necessary to set boundaries with the unhealthy people in your life. You will not be emotionally healthy if you cannot set appropriate boundaries with unhealthy people, because they're out to get you. They're out to trigger you. They're out to rain on your parade. They are out to upset you. And if you do not set emotional boundaries with emotionally upset and unhealthy people, it will affect your emotional health. Boundaries need to be realistic. Like if you're living with the person, you can't say, I never want to set eyes on the person again. And you decide you're going to put them in a box, which is their bedroom, and lock the key and throw it away. That's not a realistic boundary, is it? So we need to set realistic boundaries with those who are unhealthy. We need to be firm and kind and direct when setting the boundary. But there's no need to apologize for setting a boundary. There's no need to have to explain it all away. You know, and they know. Make sure they know there will be consequences if they can't respect the boundaries. Let's remember that consequences are not punishments. And people do not like our boundaries. They don't like when you set a boundary. They're going to rebel against your boundary. They're going to have an upset. And you follow through with what the consequences are. Consequences are the results of someone's choices. Consequences are the results of somebody's decisions that they make. If someone from your past or your present, your family or a friend or whoever is dangerous and toxic, and your boundaries are consistently violated, you have to walk away. You have to walk away. However that's going to look. Remember, I said if they are dangerous or toxic, you have to figure out your exit ramp and walk away. If you don't, you're letting the unhealthy person dictate your present and your future, and you will not be emotionally healthy. Unhealthy people don't like the boundaries, and they will often act out emotionally. Be ready for that. Stay firm and walk away when you need to. Now, finally, let's put together all of this in practical applications. First of all, recognize the iceberg in you from your family. We can easily ignore it or underestimate it, but the effect of our families is deeper than we ever have realized. The family is filled with patterns. Some are wonderful and positive and good and healthy and spiritual and strong, and others are not. But when we're unaware of them and we don't call them out and name them and deal with them, we are doomed to pass them on. So we want to commit to stop the bad choices of the past. We don't want to be a victim of it and use it as an excuse. This is where our family is. It's the way we've always been. But we want to choose to be victorious instead of being a victim of our family's past. We want to discern the good God intends in, through, and in spite of the family and the past. Because God has a plan to work out the good in whatever is happening to help us overcome our past. He's working in those mysterious ways, just as he did with Joseph. Number 3, we want to celebrate the good that came from your family and your past. We want to live in gratitude for all the wonderful things that we learned from our family, the good that was passed on and handed down, and celebrate those wonderful stories, all the traditions that are good, and that's part of our consolation. Remember, we go to God with our desolation of the bad things that happened in family and ask him to help us sort through those. That's from the lesson last week. And then we want to take those good things and celebrate and thank God. Thank you for this rich heritage that I have from my family and all those wonderful good things. And help me, Father, to deal with those that weren't good and recognize them and put them where they need to be in the past. And then we want to make the decision to do the hard work of discipleship. Discipleship is breaking the sinful patterns of the past and being recreated, being sanctified. And part of this is silence and solitude and going to Scripture and being in groups of people who are supportive, determining who we let in and who we have a boundary with. Because who we let in to this time of discipleship will either strengthen us or weaken us. We have to be careful who we let in discipleship. We want to make sure they're strong and healthy and moving forward. As followers of Christ, we spend our entire lives in sanctification, drawing closer to him. We're going to have missteps, but the hard work of discipleships, that means that we're continuing to move forward, even with a misstep. We're going to make choices in our upsets, in our family drama and history, to spiral up instead of spiraling down. Staying in a spiral of emotional dysfunction is a clear sign of an unhealthy person who has chosen not to do the hard work of discipleship. When we give in to the bad habits or the bad past or have emotional flare-ups for any reason, there's a path forward. There's a path out of that. First, we want to repent. We need to recognize what we've done, and we want to repent. Now, let's remember what repentance really is. It's moving from here to here. It's not this. It's this. And when we're in a cycle of misstep, unhealthy upset, emotional flare-ups over and over, it means we're not going from here to here. It means we're just trying to edge our way over, and then we go back again. And that's a lifetime, a habit of a sinful life. And that's where we want to make a complete course correction. This isn't perfection we're talking about. It's a decision to keep moving forward after a pattern of emotional upsets in life. It means we're giving up that sin. We're saying, I'm not going to be that person anymore. And then we ask forgiveness. And then here's what we also have to do is accept the consequences of our sinful behavior. Let's never misunderstand that God gives his grace and he gives his forgiveness and his mercy and his love. And at the same time, he says there may be some consequences for the bad decisions that you made that you just have to suffer through. And that's what happens in families, isn't it? All those choices that were made have now filtered down to consequences for families. But there's always hope. There's always a new generation. There's always a new day to make a good choice and a good decision and to give God the future and say, I'm not living in that messed up past anymore. I'm taking the best of the past and I'm carrying it forward. And I'm taking the worst of the past and I'm giving it to you. And I am going to do the hard work of discipleship to move forward. See, that is God's transformational plan for each of us. That's the hope we have, to move forward from a bad past and to take the blessings of the past with us. Father, thank you so much for the message that you've given us through the life of Joseph and the wonderful example that he has set. How he has shown us how we have a choice about how we look at all the gunk and the junk that we carry. Help us, Father, to remain faithful to your purpose for our lives, to be strong, to carry the good forward. And let us be mindful of how you are going to work the past for good if you let us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.